that pushes the blood, just a second here. That pushes the blood within the left and right ventricles upward, which causes the tricuspid and bicuspid valves to close. And the closure of the tri and bicuspid valve is where that lub sound comes from. What we didn't get to talk about was where the dub sound comes from, so let's do that now. This is an image, by the way, of where that lub sound is coming from. Again, you can see the contraction of the ventricle is pushing the blood upward, causing the valve to close, and this is where the sound comes from. All right, next. Since the tri and bicuspid valve close, what that does is it pushes the blood within the left and the right ventricle into two very distinct areas. In the case of the right ventricle, the blood is going to enter in to the pulmonary trunk, which is the beginning of the pulmonary circuit. And in the case of the left ventricle, the blood is going to enter into the aorta, which is the beginning of the systemic circuit. But in order for the blood to get into the pulmonary trunk and into the aorta, in both cases, the blood has to travel past a valve. And in the case of the pulmonary trunk, that valve is what's called the pulmonary semilunar valve. So the blood travels through the pulmonary semilunar valve in order to get into the pulmonary trunk. And in the case of the left side, the blood travels through the aortic semilunar valve in order to get into the aorta and systemic circuit. Now, what's going to happen is eventually, quite quickly, the heart is going to relax. In particular, the left and right ventricle are going to relax. And when the left and right ventricle relax, what happens is blood is no longer being pushed into the pulmonary trunk and into the aorta anymore. Because the purpose of the left and right ventricle contracting is to push the blood into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And when the left and right ventricle relax, there's nothing pushing the blood into the trunk and the aorta anymore. So what will begin to occur is the blood won't have as much pressure and it will begin to flow backwards with gravity. The blood will begin to flow backwards towards the right ventricle. Well, let's say it this way. The blood will begin to flow backwards through the pulmonary trunk towards the right ventricle. And the blood will begin to flow backwards in the aorta towards the left ventricle. But what will happen to prevent the blood from actually entering back into the right ventricle and the left ventricle is these two semilunar valves will close as the blood flows backwards against them. And as they close and shut, that prevents the blood from actually being able to get back into the right or the left ventricle. Let me show you a picture of that. Okay. So this would be the aortic semilunar valve. So the left ventricle would contract. It would push the blood into the aorta. And then as the left ventricle relaxes, there's nothing pushing that blood out into the aorta anymore. Pressure decreases and the blood begins to flow backwards with gravity. And as it does, it pushes on the aortic semilunar valve, causing it to close, and that prevents the blood from actually being able to move in a retrograde fashion back into the left ventricle. And this happens on both sides. This is the purpose of these two semilunar valves. The semilunar valves prevent the blood from flowing backwards into either the right or the left ventricle. Now, why do I say that? Because The second sound that you hear when you take a stethoscope and you put it up to someone's chest, the first thing that you hear is the lub. Well, where's lub coming from? It's coming from when the left and right ventricle contract. That's not where the sound comes from, but when the left and right ventricle contract, the blood gets pushed upwards, causes the tri- and bicuspid valve to close. That creates the lub sound. But then what creates the dub sound, which comes right afterwards? You hear lub, and then you hear the dub sound. Okay? The dub sound is coming after the left and right ventricle relax, and the blood flows backwards and shuts the semilunar valves. The dub sound is the semilunar valves closing. The dub sound is not the left and right ventricle relaxing. Yes, you need that to happen, but that's not where the sound comes from. The sound is coming from the blood flowing backwards towards the right and left ventricles, causing the semilunar valves to close, and once they shut, you hear that dub sound. All right, so those are your two heart sounds, right? Lub and dub, and you can actually, if you take a real clinical course, you can actually somewhat discern between all four of the different valves. We're not getting into that kind of thing, but as a general rule, you hear lub dub when you listen to someone's heart, and this is where the sounds are coming from. Now, if you think about like a heart murmur, I know I mentioned this, but one more time, what you would have is you would have to have damage to one of these valves, and it could be to any one of these. It could be to the bi or the tricuspid valve, or it could be from the pulmonary or aortic semilunar valve. Most of the time, statistically speaking, it is over here to the mitral valve, also known as the bicuspid valve. And we'll talk about why that is in just a little bit, but what happens is the mitral or bicuspid valve is damaged in some way, and it doesn't shut correctly, and the blood flows backwards into the left atrium. So instead of hearing a nice, crisp lub sound, you don't hear the bi and tricuspid valve close appropriately. Instead, you hear like a whooshing noise instead of a nice lub sound. And what the whooshing noise is it's actually blood traveling through this mitral or bicuspid valve that isn't closing correctly, and it's flowing through it and going back into the left atrium. And that's the sound that you're hearing. And that is that's why someone listens to your heart, is they're typically listening to see, is there a heart murmur? Does the closure of these two valves sound normal? And if it doesn't, it's appropriate at that point to do some extra testing. All right, so the heart sounds. Next, let's talk about two terms, systole and diastole. The word systole and diastole are not the same thing as systolic and diastolic blood pressure, but they're related to them. Systole is quite simple. All it means is the contraction of a chamber. And that is it. Doesn't mean anything else. Diastole is the opposite. It means relaxation of a chamber. So we can get this out of the way right off the bat. When you use the term systole, a lot of people will just say systole and implying the heart is contracting. Or they'll say diastole, which implies that the heart is relaxing. But to use these correctly, you really need to be talking about one specific chamber, because that's the way that we do things clinically. We would look at like left ventricular systole, which means we're looking at when the left ventricle contracts. Now we can acknowledge that the left and right ventricle contract at the same time, but we really measure the ejection of blood and these sort of things by looking at one chamber at a time. At the same, to that end, I should say, we could also look at left ventricular diastole. And that would be when the left ventricle relaxes. And you could do the same thing for the left and right atrium. You could call it left atrial systole, left atrial diastole. These terms should really be applied to specific chambers of the heart. Now, what's the difference between systole and diastole, and then things like systolic and diastolic blood pressure? So, when you get your blood pressure taken, what's happening is you're getting two terms, right? A healthy person, you'd see something like 120 over 70, which means their systolic blood pressure is 120 and their diastolic blood pressure is 70. That's measured in millimeters of mercury. And let's just define systolic and diastolic blood pressure first and then expand on that a little bit. So blood pressure, first of all, it's in the name. What is blood pressure? It's the pressure that the blood exerts against a vessel. I know we talked about this actually in like the first week when I went through an example of homeostasis, but just as a reminder, blood pressure it's quite literally defined in the term the pressure that blood is exerting against a vessel. So systolic blood pressure, the top number, is the maximum amount of pressure that blood exerts against a vessel wall. And diastolic is the opposite. It's the minimum amount of pressure that the blood exerts against a vessel wall. So when someone takes your blood pressure, or you take somebody else's blood pressure, and you get the systolic and diastolic pressure, and you read it out to them, what you're actually telling them is for that particular artery, in this case it would be like the brachial artery, you're telling them the maximum amount of blood pressure that's being exerted against the vessel, and you're telling them the minimum amount of pressure that the blood is exerting against that vessel. And that's all you're getting out of that. It's an important value because it can tell you a lot about their potential health, but that's how simple a blood pressure is. It's really just maximum and minimum pressure that's being exerted by the blood on that vessel wall. Now, where do the terms systole and diastole come into play? Because they're not the same thing. Systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure is not the same thing as systole and diastole, but they're related to each other. So let's do it like this. What if we had left ventricular systole? That would mean the left ventricle is contracting. Systole means contraction, left ventricular systole, left ventricle contracting. If the left ventricle is contracting, what it's doing is it's pumping blood through the aortic semilunar valve out into the aorta. The aorta will eventually branch into your brachial artery, which is where we oftentimes take blood pressure. When the left ventricle contracts, it forcefully, very forcefully, pushes blood out into the aorta and rest of the systemic arteries, all of the different arteries that the aorta is going to branch into. Now, this is the period in time where the maximum amount of blood pressure is going to be generated. It should make sense, because when is the blood going to exert more pressure than right after it has been forcefully ejected out of the left ventricle? That, of course, is going to be the point in time where the blood exerts maximal pressure against the vessel walls is right after it's been propelled out of the left ventricle. So left ventricular systole really kind of causes systolic blood pressure. After the left ventricle contracts and forcefully ejects that blood out into the systemic arteries, that is when you get systolic blood pressure. Maximal pressure being exerted by the blood against the vessel walls. And to follow that up, what about how diastole and diastolic blood pressure relate to one another? Again, the two terms are not the same, but what we could say is, what about left ventricular diastole? When the left ventricle relaxes left ventricular diastole, blood is not being pushed out of the left ventricle into the systemic arteries anymore. This correlates, left ventricular diastole, with the point in time that blood exerts minimum pressure against the vessel walls, which is diastolic blood pressure. So when left ventricular diastole occurs, that is generally and approximately when you get diastolic blood pressure, minimum pressure that blood exerts against the vessel walls. And it only makes sense, again, if the left ventricle is not contracting and it's not pushing blood out into your systemic arteries, then the blood is going to be exerting the least amount of force against those vessel walls, which is diastolic pressure. So that's how these two terms are related to each other, but are not the same thing. Okay. And the last thing I want to say here before moving on to the next PowerPoint is that the left ventricle, I've mentioned this indirectly a variety of times, but let's talk about it for real this time. The left ventricle is much more muscular than the right ventricle is. Again, you can see how much more cardiac muscle there is within the left ventricle than there is within the right ventricle. And without getting into the kind of physics equations that are involved with this, which we will eventually, why does the left ventricle need to be so much more muscular than the right ventricle? And the basic answer to that is this all deals with what's called resistance. Basically, how hard is it to push fluid through a circuit? And again, without getting into the math of this, if you have a longer circuit, it's generally harder to push fluid through it. And again, this is quite easy to calculate. Pretend we have two circuits, they have the same exact radius, they're made out of the same material, and one is much, much, much longer than the other. It takes a lot more pressure to get the fluid through the longer circuit than the shorter circuit. So to expand on that, your systemic circuit is almost infinitely longer than your pulmonary circuit. Your systemic circuit is massive. You can hardly put into words how long your systemic circuit is. If you were to take every blood vessel in your body and line the cells up one by one, it could circle the world. So it's a massive circuit of blood vessels. And what the left ventricle has to do is the left ventricle has to contract and push blood through the entire systemic circuit, which is incredibly long. And the right ventricle only has to push the blood through the pulmonary circuit, which is much shorter. So this is why the left ventricle has to be so much more muscular, because it needs to generate way more force to generate enough pressure to push the blood through a much longer circuit than the right ventricle does. All right. That is the end of that particular PowerPoint. And we're now moving on to, I think, part 2 here. This one's quite short. So, what we want to start off doing here is comparing skeletal and cardiac muscle. These are, on the left, 3 skeletal muscle fibers. What do we know about skeletal muscle fibers? They need an alpha motor neuron to travel out to them and synapse with them so that the alpha motor neuron can pass them action potentials, and that allows the skeletal muscle fibers to contract. We've talked about that a lot. What about the heart? Well, you notice when you look at the heart and you look at the cardiac muscle fibers, you don't see alpha motor neurons traveling out to the heart. Cardiac muscle fibers don't work that way. Cardiac muscle fibers do not need an alpha motor neuron to pass them an action potential to allow them to contract. The fascinating thing about cardiac muscle fibers, the muscle fibers of your heart, is they can generate their own action potentials and contract by themselves without having an action potential passed to them by an alpha motor neuron. Anytime that you want your biceps muscle fibers to contract, you need your primary motor cortex neurons to generate action potentials, pass those action potentials to alpha motor neurons, which then pass the action potentials to the muscle fibers, and the muscle fibers contract. If you think about your heart, it doesn't work like that whatsoever. There are cardiac muscle fibers, specific groups of them, that can just generate their own action potentials without having any passed to them. And then they can generate their own action potentials, and they can actually contract by themselves. So that's the first aspect that's very different between skeletal muscle fibers and cardiac muscle fibers, is the fact that cardiac muscle fibers just aren't innervated by alpha motor neurons. The second part to this is, assuming like these are 3 skeletal muscle fibers within your biceps muscle, there's actually hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers within your biceps muscle, not just 3. But if these are the only 3 that have an action potential passed to them, then these are the only 3 muscle fibers within your entire biceps muscle that are going to contract. So the point I'm making is, you can get a relatively small number of muscle fibers within a skeletal muscle to contract. If only a small number of alpha motor neurons generate action potentials, then only a small number of muscle fibers within a given skeletal muscle will actually receive action potentials and contract. Skeletal muscle fibers are all kind of independent of one another. This is very different when we talk about the heart. When one cardiac muscle fiber contracts, they all do. you can't just have like 3 cardiac muscle fibers within the heart contract and then none of the other muscle fibers of the heart contract. You'd never get that. Instead, if a given number of cardiac muscle fibers contract, they all contract because the action potential spreads between all of them. They're all attached to each other. We'll get to the anatomy and physiology of this pretty soon. But all of these cardiac muscle fibers are attached to each other in a way that allows for when one contracts, they all do. The action potential can just move amongst all the cardiac muscle fibers at once, and they can then all contract simultaneously, more or less. Completely different when you're talking about skeletal muscle. Yeah.
So would the size principle be like applied here or no?
Be what?
The size principle, is that applied here?
No, it can't be, because if alpha motor neurons don't travel out to the heart, you can't have a size principle. Because the size principle implies that you can recruit different numbers of alpha motor neurons to cause varying numbers of muscle fibers within a whole muscle to contract. And with the heart, there are no alpha motor neurons that travel out to the heart. And if one cardiac muscle fiber contracts, they're all going to contract. So no, the size principle wouldn't apply to the heart. That's a good question. And the point of this was to just, for the moment, to just briefly introduce you to these 2 concepts, that the heart doesn't have alpha motor neurons, and that when one fiber contracts, they all do. And then from there, now we want to elaborate on those details. Okay. So what you're looking at here is what's commonly referred to as the conduction system. I'm going to tell you about the conduction system in probably a very different way than you've heard about it in the past. And to start off with, when you talk about the conduction system, you always start off by talking about what's called the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node is up here. It's in the upper right atrium of the heart. And immediately, let's dispel the idea that the sinoatrial node is in some way structurally different than the rest of the heart. On a structural level, the sinoatrial node isn't different really at all. There's a little bit of differences. There's a little bit less actin and myosin within the fibers, but I mean, on a structural level, if you were to just take a chunk out of the right atrium where the sinoatrial node is, and you were to look at it histologically, you would never be able to tell the difference between the sinoatrial node and the other cardiac muscle fibers that are right next to it. It's highlighted in yellow, which makes it look like it's this like mysterious alternative part of the heart. And it's like, it's not like that at all. The sinoatrial node is a collection of cardiac muscle fibers. And the sinoatrial node fibers look just like the other cardiac muscle fibers of the heart. But it is nonetheless a specialized group of cardiac muscle fibers. And what makes the sinoatrial node fibers unique is the fact that they can generate their own action potentials. That's what makes the SA node, as it's oftentimes called, unique. It can generate its own action potentials, the fibers that make it up. But other than that, the SA node, it looks just like all the other cardiac muscle fibers of the heart. But unfortunately, and I somewhat get images like this, just trying to show the whole conduction system, which makes some degree of sense. But whenever you focus in on the sinoatrial node in an image, it's always kind of drawn like this. I think I may have another one on. No, that's on the next PowerPoint. It's drawn like this, where like the sinoatrial node is being highlighted in purple. And why it needs to be done like this. I've never understood, and it just creates a ton of confusion, because if this were the sinoatrial node, I mean, logic would tell you from looking at the image that it's very different than the other cardiac muscle fibers of the right atrium, because that's what those are right there. All of these are cardiac muscle fibers of the right atrium. And this is supposed to be the sinoatrial node, which is in purple and doesn't look anything like the other ones. But the thing is, if this were drawn to, with some degree of accuracy of what you would actually see, this is more or less what it should look like. The sinoatrial node should look just like these other cardiac muscle fibers of the right atrium. These fibers should not look any different than these. It should be the same. And again, if you really get in and you start looking at all the proteins inside, there are slight differences, but they're really visually and mostly structurally identical. So here's the thing though. They're unique, and images try to highlight their uniqueness. I think in a little bit too of an exaggerated fashion, often, like always for whatever reason. But this is what you would see. It would just be a regular old looking cardiac muscle fiber. But it has this unique capacity to generate its own action potentials. So what we really want to do is we want to focus in on these sinoatrial node fibers. Again, just regular old looking cardiac muscle fibers that are part of the right atrium, and try to understand how it's possible for them to generate their own action potentials. How do they do it? How do they not have an alpha motor neuron that passes an action potential to them? If they don't have excitatory neurotransmitters released onto them, what allows them to be able to generate these action potentials? So here we will draw a sinoatrial node fiber. This is one fiber of the SA node. Now there's many. There's actually a lot of cardiac muscle fibers that make up the sinoatrial node, but we're just looking at one. So, first of all, sinoatrial node fibers do not have resting membrane potentials. How do they not have resting membrane potentials? It's not that they don't have membrane potentials, it's that they don't have resting membrane potentials. And the reason I say that is because the membrane potential is always fluctuating. It goes up, and then it goes down, and then it goes back up, and then it goes back down, and then it goes back up. It never rests. So it's not that they don't have membrane potentials and generate action potentials, it's that their membrane potentials never rest. Like if you probe them and you look at them, the membrane potential is just always shifting. Now, when your heart is beating at rest, around 70 beats per minute or so, what it will have is kind of a peak negative value. It will reach negative 60 millivolts or so, and it won't go any more negative than that. At that point, it gets stuck, but it doesn't rest there. So remember, neurons have a resting membrane potential of negative 70, skeletal muscle fibers are like negative 90. Now what I'm showing you here is the sinoatrial node fiber itself doesn't have a resting membrane potential, it just has like a peak negative value, sometimes called its diastolic potential, of negative 60 millivolts. What begins to happen at negative 60 that prevents it from becoming any more negative? There are these channels in the sinoatrial node that are very unique, and they're so unique that they were named, and this is true, funny channels. They're actually called F-type channels, and the F stands for funny. And they were referred to as funny channels because they have some very funny properties to them, unique, strange properties to them. And that is, they're actually voltage-gated sodium channels. Funny channels are voltage-gated sodium channels. But the thing is, they're voltage-gated sodium channels that behave in the exact opposite way of all the other ones that we've talked about, which is why they're funny and unique. Most voltage-gated sodium channels that we've discussed do what? As the interior becomes more as the interior becomes more positive, like let's think about the hillock. If you can drive the hillock of an axon from -70 to -55, you depolarize the inside of the hillock, then the voltage-gated sodium channels will open and sodium will rush out. My point is, most voltage-gated sodium channels, as you depolarize the inside, that's what causes them to open. A depolarizing voltage is what opens most voltage-gated sodium channels. But in this case, it is the opposite with funny channels. As the inside becomes progressively more negative, that is what triggers the funny channels to open. So as the interior of this SA node fiber becomes more and more negative, the negativity is what triggers funny channels to open. So when we hit -60 millivolts, all I can tell you for the moment is that funny channels begin to open because they sense the voltage, and they're sensing a sufficiently negative voltage, and that's what causes their gates to begin to pop open. And remember, they're sodium channels. So what do we know about sodium? Sodium is high outside of our cells, and it's low inside of our cells. So sodium has a chemical driving force to come in. What does it also have in this case? Well, it has a very strong electrical driving force to come in because the inside is -60 millivolts. So if these funny channels begin to open, then sodium has both a chemical and an electrical driving force to enter into the SA node fiber, and it does. It begins to come through these funny channels, and as it enters, you can probably imagine the influx of sodium ions into this SA node fiber begins to cause it to depolarize, right? Become more positive. So now the membrane potential begins to reverse and go in the opposite direction. It begins to go from becoming more negative and reaching -70 to immediately transitioning to becoming more positive or depolarizing. And it begins to move up towards -50. So as the interior goes from -60 towards -50, this is mostly a product of the influx of sodium through the funny channels. Now there may be some other channels that are involved in this too, but there's enough controversy around it that I'm not going to introduce them because I don't think it adds any benefit to the discussion. Most of the depolarization is a product of sodium coming in through the funny channels. And -50 is the threshold for SA node fibers. So basically, if you can get the interior to move from -60 to -50 millivolts, then the SA node fiber will get to threshold. And what happens at threshold? Now we start to see some other really unique things that happen here compared to other cells that we've talked about. When we get to threshold, what's going to open up are voltage-gated channels. But they're not the type of voltage-gated channels that you've seen in the past. Usually when you get to threshold, what happens? Voltage-gated sodium channels open up, like in the hillock, or next to the motor end plate of a skeletal muscle fiber. In this case, when the SA node fiber gets to threshold, what happens is, let me change the color to something else. What happens at threshold is voltage-gated calcium channels open. These are called L-type calcium channels. The L stands for long. That'll be important, not today, but in the next lecture. It means they kind of stay open for a long time. All right, so we get to threshold, and then these voltage-gated calcium channels, L-type channels, open. Basically, when the interior hits -50, that is when these L-type voltage-gated calcium channels are designed to pop open. That's their threshold voltage. And they open up, and what do we know about calcium? Calcium is high outside, and calcium is low inside. So it has a chemical driving force to enter. What does it also have right now? The interior is -50, so you better believe it also has an electrical driving force to enter as well. And it does. It comes in through its chemical and electrical driving force through these voltage-gated calcium channels, L-type channels. And the influx of calcium through these voltage-gated calcium channels causes the interior to probably hit maybe like +10 or +20. That's pretty much its peak positivity. And you might say, well, does sodium contribute to this at all? No. Once, and I should have mentioned this, once the interior hits threshold, which is like -50, those funny channels all close. So they're not contributing at all anymore. Again, once we get to threshold, let's just say two things happen. First of all, the funny channels close, they're not involved anymore. And at threshold, most importantly, the L-type voltage-gated calcium channels open because that is their threshold, and calcium shoots in, drives the interior up to +10. And now, these L-type channels span the entire length of the SA node fiber. So over here, presumably, it would still be negative. I don't know if it would be exactly -60, but it would still be negative in the adjacent part of the SA node fiber where perhaps funny channels don't exist. So what would happen is this big wave, this big depolarization will begin to move towards the adjacently negative region, and it will depolarize that region. And as it depolarizes that region, you can probably guess what's going to happen. It's going to open more voltage-gated calcium channels, L-type channels. And as those L-type voltage-gated calcium channels open, more calcium is going to shoot in and drive the interior up to +10. And now this big depolarization, which is made up of calcium ions, is going to move into the next adjacently negative region of this SA node fiber. It's going to depolarize that region as calcium, which is a positive ion, moves into that region. And as it depolarizes it, more voltage-gated calcium channels, L-type channels, are going to open. And more calcium is going to shoot in and drive the interior up to +10. What you're seeing here is an action potential. What's happening is an action potential is propagating down the SA node fiber. What is an action potential? By definition, an action potential is a non-decremental wave of electricity or voltage that travels down a membrane. And that's exactly what you're seeing here, right? It's +10, +10, +10, +10, traveling down the whole length of the SA node fiber. But the interesting thing is, with this SA node fiber and all of the other ones, they propagate their action potentials using calcium. They don't propagate their action potentials using sodium. And that's also entirely different than everything else that we've talked about up until this point. Neurons propagate their action potentials using sodium. Skeletal muscle fibers propagate their action potentials using sodium. And now you're seeing SA node fibers of the heart, pacemaker cells they're sometimes called, they propagate their action potentials using calcium. And there's an obvious question, which is why would they use a different ion than all the other cells that we've talked about? And I can't answer that for you just yet, but there's a very important reason why these pacemaker cells, again, called SA node fibers, propagate their action potentials using calcium. Is an incredibly important reason for this. And we'll get to that in much more detail in our next class. So this is how the SA node fiber generates an action potential. Now, let me finish by saying in our next class, I'll show you how this action potential that's generated by these SA node fibers is ultimately going to spread into all of the other cardiac muscle fibers of your heart, and is going to cause your whole heart to contract. But the obvious problem lies in this, which is if the SA node fiber just generated an action potential, it probably needs to generate another one, right? Because your heart beats about 70 times per minute at rest. And this action potential that the sinoatrial node fiber just generated, it is going to propagate into all of the other cardiac fibers of your heart and cause your whole heart to contract. But then this needs to happen again. It needs to happen 70 times over the course of a minute. So what this SA node fiber needs to do is it needs to repolarize and get back to around negative 60 millivolts. So how exactly does it do that? And if you recall neurons, this will be very easy. So if we're at like positive 10 all over the place, what would be the kind of current position that we're in? First of all, funny channels would be closed because they closed when we got to threshold. So if these are the funny channels, the F-type channels are all shut. Now, what about the voltage-gated calcium channels, the L-type channels? Those would presumably be open because they just allowed calcium to come in. They were open and they allowed calcium to flow into all of these different regions and drive the interior up to positive 10. Why does the interior get stuck at positive 10? To understand that, you've got to understand what opened at threshold. How did the voltage-gated calcium channels open at threshold? Just like voltage-gated sodium channels open within a neuron at threshold, what happened is when the interior got to negative 50, from negative 60 to negative 50, the calcium channels opened, specifically their activation gates opened, and that's what allowed calcium to flow in. And then when the interior gets to positive 10, from our discussions of neurons, perhaps you can imagine what happens at positive 10. The inactivation gate of the voltage-gated calcium channel is what closes. So at positive 10, the calcium channels would close, and that would prevent any more calcium from coming in. But very importantly, what closes are the inactivation gates at positive 10. No more calcium can enter. At the same time, maybe you can think about what's probably also occurring. At positive 10, two things are going to occur. The voltage-gated calcium channels are going to close, so no more calcium can come in. The inside won't become any more positive. And if we want to make the inside more negative, then what are we also going to need to open? Voltage-gated potassium channels. At positive 10, voltage-gated potassium channels open, and potassium has both a chemical driving force to leave because it's high on the inside, low on the outside, and it has a bit of an electrical driving force to leave too because the outside would be a little bit negative if the inside's a little bit positive. So calcium would shoot out, and that would begin to drive us back down towards -60. Okay, I'll finish with this right at the beginning of class on Wednesday, and then we'll move into the rest of the heart.